You're listening to From the Horse's Mouth, intrepid conversations with Phil Fersht. Ready to meet the disruptors who are guiding us to the new great utopia by reshaping our world and pushing past corporate spin for honest conversations about the future impact of current and emerging technologies? Tune in now.
Great to get another edition of the Horse's Mouth moving, and today I'm very happy to have an old friend in the industry who I've known for several years now, who has come a long way during the time I've met her, but maybe I'll ask her to introduce herself and a little bit about her upbringing, where she came from, and how she got to where she is today. So Katie Stein, welcome, over to you.
Thanks, Phil. It has been a long time since maybe the one office, more recently the generative enterprise, and now I'm sure we'll touch on your new frame. But I'm Katie Stein. I've known you, Phil, for almost a decade now, I think. And a year ago, I took over as the CEO of IGT Solutions, which as a company, we're lesser known, but really we were born in the travel transportation industry in the experience sector. And so we serve most of the global brands, and now that extends from, what we think of as traditional airlines and hotels through to all of the platform companies, who are also travel brands, whether we think of Uber or Airbnb, and those sorts of providers. So very excited to talk about the space because there's a lot of discussion around what's happening with AI in the space of experience. So I think it's very relevant and timely. Thanks for having me.
Right. Yeah. And, a little bit about your background. Obviously, we met while you were at the BPO company Genpact. Oh, they probably want to call themselves something else today. The GE spin out, and you did very well there, didn't you? I think by the end, you were pretty much the right hand of the CEO, Tiger. And so, could you talk a bit more about that experience and how it led to what you're doing today?
Yeah, I think that was a great experience. I spent nearly 10 years at Genpact. I had previously to Genpact worked at Mercer. You recently had a guest from Mercer
Yeah.
on your podcast. And there I'd actually worked on setting up some of our captives. So BPO wasn't new to me, or offshoring wasn't new to me, but Genpact was a tremendous experience of seeing a firm that went from primarily back office focused services through to thinking more one office as we extended into the middle office and front offices and tried to connect those workflows. And then obviously we made a significant push on thinking of how we would reimagine those services using at the time automation, then analytics and data. And now I think there's a rebranding around agentic-led
Mhm.
solutions. So, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And um, can you share a little bit candidly about, Genpact had a very distinct culture coming from a GE heritage, a very Indian male-dominated culture. What was it like for a smart, ambitious white woman working in that environment? Can you share a few tips on what was successful and what was challenging for you?
Yeah, uh, one of the things I've been thinking about, someone asked me the other day, like, what motivates you at IGT Solutions every day? Because work is hard. We wouldn't do work and we wouldn't call it work if it wasn't hard. And I was saying one of my biggest learning lessons at Genpact, because of its scale, being over $4 billion, being the size over 100,000 people, was how do you drive change? And change has a lot to do with culture and mindset in an organization of that scale. And I think that's something that I had a lot of, challenge at Genpact, seeing how we would drive through a traditional BPO mindset into what is now required as a new headset to drive into the future of where the industry is going. And what I love about my experience now at IGT Solutions is it's a smaller scale. We're sub $500 million, but we have the same challenges. We're a Delhi-based, largely organization. Most of our headcount exists in, the Philippines and India and other emerging sort of services areas. And so thinking now about how we reimagine and take all those lessons from Genpact and apply them in a smaller scale to accelerate. And I think that for this industry is one of the biggest challenges is that there's sort of that like dead middle um, where change really gets stuck because what's made us successful historically is still limping along, but won't get us to where we need to go. So, yeah.
Yeah. It's a great point. Like, why won't it get us where we need to go? Because I just came back from a very long tour around India, which I enjoyed very much, by the way, and huge feverish excitement around global capability centers, and they feel that's the new frontier. And I was cautiously poking questions in around, it's one thing embracing Indian talent, but are you truly going to be at the decision-making table for your corporate motherships in the States and UK, these other places? Um, so what needs to change from the existing mindset you feel to propel these companies to the future?
Yeah, I think one of the things we wrestle with is that strategically, I think we all understand the power of what we could develop and deliver. But the one thing we have no control over, I heard someone recently on one of your podcasts say change is a constant. Sure, change is a constant. Speed of change is the unknown, right? And the
Yeah.
speed of change in my mind is very much locked in the fact that at least at our large enterprise customers, this, one office, cross-functional, cross-silo concept is very immature. And so we have I'll call it a commercial buyer who's interested in strategically the outcomes we can deliver. You have a functional buyer, who's really buying at the vendor level, who's focused on, I'll call it, renegotiating, squeezing vendors. And then you have sort of, other players around this. And so the fact is we're talking about these big outcomes we can drive, but most of that then filters down to, okay, an FT count, a minute count, and that's been pervasive for a long time. So my question is really like, when does the tipping point shift over? And I think maybe 10% of customers are getting there, but that leaves 90% who are still at the executive levels, at the board level talking about this, but when it dilutes down in the organization, still see the vendor enterprise relationship as one which is not a partnership. It's about squeezing cost out of the equation.
Yeah. And I've also heard from many enterprise customers that there's always another BPO coming along who can do it cheaper, who's smaller, more focused, and cost driven, and that sort of thing. And I guess you're hitting on the point on what's the tipping point. But what is the tipping point really, Katie? I mean, what is truly going to change the mindset of how services are delivered, how they're bought, how these partnerships arise?
Yeah, so I think for our perspective at IGT Solutions, the first thing that we came in and started to look at was before you get to even agentic workflows, which we are doing work around and we're designing systems there, but at the core of experience is what is the role of the agent and what is the role of AI, right? And why? Why does this matter? So the first thing that struck me is that in the space of experience, there's a lot of friction trapped between the enterprise and the vendors with respect to volumes are not static, right? In a given day, how you as an end consumer want to interact with a brand, which channel you want to use, what complaint or question or query you have varies. When a flight has a challenge versus when you just want to rebook your ticket. Those are very different for each individual in terms of how they want to interact. And so this workforce management, workforce forecasting is very static compared to that. And so to me, the first changing point is how can we become agile together where we change the equation to be agents plus agentic or plus AI so that we can flex up and down with each other. And that to me is the first place to commercially renegotiate, right? Because what you're doing is taking costs that's locked on both sides of the equation and you're actually creating a win-win for both. And if you do that successfully and commercially renegotiate, then you're doing it in a way that you're not penalizing either side, and there are higher margins available to the vendor because you can manage workforce and technology, and there's lower costs to the recipient, the enterprise, because you're able to do that. And so I think picking the spot, rather than talking about outcomes that are being discussed at the board level, to me, it's picking the spot where we can actually demonstrate that value and unlock it at the buyer level that we're working. Otherwise, you're just caught in sort of a hyperbole loop, which the management consultants and everyone else are talking about, which I think is the rare enterprise that's driving at that level.
Right, right. So picking the spot feels to me like cutting through all the bullshit and getting to what are we delivering and how can we, one, develop technology that's scalable, that advances your own team's ability to take advantage of AI tools.
I think I think
Yeah,
that's right, and Phil, not to cut you off there, but to say, like,
so
right now we have this blunt force object. We have a lot of technology coming into the market, and I'm repeating what you and I have said for ages, which is technology for the sake of technology is just more technical debt into the equation, more, you know, more misfunction. But if you think about in the space of experience, it's allowing us now to do what we can do, which is to separate centers of skill from centers of scale. Right, so things that are rules-based, things that can be automated should be automated, and we should be leading the way on that. We should be leading the way on self-healing, self-help. Centers of skill become now where we create agentic plus humans, centers that now can deliver more value on time in the channel that's required. Yeah.
centers of skill. That's a new word I just learned today. Thank you very much. I think you're really hitting on a point. I mean, I've sat through probably more client roundtables, conferences, discussions, debates, paid engagements than anyone in the last couple of years on this. And I'm sensing a, an increased awareness from enterprise clients, but also an increased level of paranoia. Because I think there's a definite sense that they're just struggling to get beyond the talk. And this sounds like a great idea. Our board wants to do this, and just get to the brass tacks of what is that one thing we can really agree on and start making moves with. It really feels like we're moving into almost a period of frustration where there's just this inertia happening, and it's not just at the client level, it's also at the provider level, where providers still only know how to sell one way, know how to deliver one way, and they don't really want to change either. So it feels like there's this, you need both sides to be coming to the table with, like, we're both under tremendous pressure to deliver differently. I saw one of your competitors launch their on the BPO offering the other day.
I saw that.
Clearly, to me, it just spelt of, we gotta change, guys, coming out there. So,
Is anyone
um,
listening? I
is anyone listening?
Yeah. I think one of the things though, like I was wrestling with a team the other day and with a client is again, change at this stage of uncertainty, I think happens at the micro levels. So if I step back into the space of experience, forget the unBPO or all these things, and I say, okay, what creates the failure point? We know that a lot of end users, consumers, there's been surveys done, aren't yet comfortable because of past experience, because of fear themselves to interact with autonomous agents. And we know that a lot of the people who own the process at the client level are very afraid of that, right? Because when something goes wrong, it's very public. I mean, we have the Air Canada example that we can all point back to. So let's talk about what we're solving for. Like, one of the things I heard recently that I think is really remarkably different now in the dialogue around AI is the ability for it to understand intent. And this is something that humans struggle with. In a call center environment, right? Like when we have most clients want to move from expensive voice to, let's say, chat. But for agents to understand the intent in a chat, now you've got sort of disparate, think of how we all chat. It's short sentences, it's coming at you, it's not really a two-way dialogue. How does the agent understand that? So if we can use AI to make sure that the agent understands the intent and is responding first time right, that's a game changer. Just starting there, it allows a brand to move in a trusted fashion, in a higher CSAT fashion, a lot of voice calls to a channel like chat, which is more productive, lower cost, and can have higher quality if we train the agents right and if we use AI right. And so again, like it may sound very small, but if we start doing these things, these are game changers in a space where sitting in a queue waiting on a phone to talk to an agent is frustrating to all of us. I would rather chat. I just don't get the response I want from chat today.
Yeah. Um, and it seems like there has been, what's happened in the last 10 years plus has been a continued rush to move services to the Philippines. This is what I've seen in the call center space. And it's got to the point where the quality of services in the Philippines has got worse and worse. I don't know about you, but every time I call my mobile provider or my bank, whatever, it's going to the Philippines, and you're getting somebody who can barely hold a conversation at this point. And it's kind of frustrating. You're actually at the point of, I might as well just be talking to a robot. I'm just trying to get something done, or I'm trying to get my international data plan switched back on, or something like that, right? Is that a tipping point you think we're hitting as well, or as we're just exhausted resources for driving these services?
Well, you know, my observation, my learning from being in this industry now for a year is that there was a period of, let's say, COVID, and then there was a post-COVID boom where volumes surged, and you saw it in the valuations of all these CX firms. Just it was a buoyant growth period, and I would say that period should probably be renamed cheekily as like just get bodies on the phone, right?
Yeah.
And it's stepped away from what I'm saying, which is, look, if this can be automated, if what you're trying to do is reset a password and we can automate a response to you, we should. Right? Why do you need to talk to someone for that? But centers of skill then become what's speed to proficiency. So like I was talking about earlier, like let's say your mobile company has to the volume surge around Christmas time because everyone buys a new phone for Christmas or whatever it is, right? Today, the way that it works is everyone rushes to hire people for that period, right? Because the vendor doesn't want to, the partner doesn't want to carry the cost of those people year round. The provider doesn't want to pay for the cost of those people year round. Well, that sort of steps away from skill. Like, so if that's the way that it has to work, we have to use AI, and that's what we're focused on for speed to proficiency. How do we take people and in a matter of weeks make them as skilled with as high of quality scores as an agent who's been sitting and doing those responses for a year? And that to me is the challenge that we as providers can tackle, and we are working with one of our partners, Oxo.ai, to do that.
Yeah. Interesting. So moving forward, um, how do you see the current plethora of service firms evolving in light of what we've just been talking about? Where they're still, some of them are still bumbling along with 3-4% growth. They're still trying to eke out some sort of existence on the old model. Um, I personally think we're in a calm before the storm. Because the more clients figure out why do we need to spend 20 million a year on this or 50 million a year on that when we can just get things so much cheaper, this is going to start to have a knock-on effect, and especially in areas like the more back officey stuff, like just moving data from one screen to another or processing invoices, these types of elements. Is there going to be just an acceleration suddenly of services making this shift from people to technology?
See, this is like if you ask me what's the thing we haven't solved yet, is what is candidly the people work and what's the technology work. I came back to a very simple frame of, what's rules based, what's not. But AI complicates that right now because AI is obviously evolving. And one could argue that human errors may be greater than AI errors in specific cases, right? So therein lies a challenge. And then there's adoption, both from within the walls of the company and the
Right.
consumer. So to me, I fully agree we're in the calm before the storm. I said earlier, I think that timescales are unpredictable. We will always be, and I will always be more provocative that it'll be sooner. And history has shown that it has taken longer, but had maybe greater impact than we could have ever imagined in each of these iterations of technological innovation. But I think that for all of us, and this is what we're pushing on and seeing, is that if we stay just focused on cost, like if a contact center, if the operating center within an enterprise's only function is to deliver cost, it's an oxymoron to the fact that they are an experience center, right? Ultimately, if we want to come out of this recessionary mindset, organizations have to get back to a headset of growth. And that gets back to things we used to talk about, like customer lifetime value, right? And there you can see the distinction or the distance between what a manager is managing for, which is cost, operational efficiency, which is really a question around automation,
Right.
versus maybe a higher order set of objectives. And it's to the enterprise to give that to that function to drive, right? Because if the chief customer officer and marketing are focused on growth and operations is focused on cost and productivity, I actually think those organizations, those enterprises will fall behind very quickly.
It's interesting. And do you think there's going to be a drive towards more um, work being run out of the US, for example? So using agentic, if I can deliver what 150 people are currently delivering for me in the Philippines with 15 people in the States using smart agentic tools, is that going to bring that work back? I mean, I just saw Apple announce something like 500 billion reinvestment in it. They're trying to move their whole business back to the States. They're almost becoming like the end, the change company at the moment. But is this going to really change this global talent game? I think is where I'm going here, because I was around in 2012 when we introduced RPA to the world, and we were having this exact conversation back then, which is, hey, we've got this great software that can scrape screens and automate process and do this stuff that people. The problem was the technology couldn't scale; it was too brittle, it was very one-dimensional, and most companies who bought RPA licenses tended to dump it 2 or 3 layers down the organization where it got lost somewhere and the onus fell away. Now we actually have technology which is incredible. Like, I can talk to you for 20 seconds and come up with a perfect agentic image of Katie and your accent and blah, 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 blah. It's been done to me, right? It's there. And this is about taking work that humans are doing, and rather than moving it to another human on the other side of the world, we're now saying we're going to move that to a piece of software. So that's a change paradigm that companies have never gone through before. This is what I think is the real issue here is we're going through change that no one's actually experienced. We're seeing only 12% of enterprises doing anything at this level. How are companies going to cope with that, do you feel? Because this is coming. I think it's coming over the next 12 to 18 months quite aggressively at us. How do you think companies are going to cope with this? How do you think we're going to create a positive mindset within organizations to embrace agentic and embrace working with IT like we've never worked before?
Yeah. And I think you mentioned the Apple thing. I mean, I also, though, maybe the last few months have made me a little bit more skeptical of everything that I read at face value in the media as to what that really means. So I'll park that there. But, I think in terms of how companies, first, let's talk about like how companies think of their strategy. Um, uh, you know, I think that the first thing is that within the enterprise, I mean, going back to everything you've been saying, Phil, for years, companies have still not become one office, right? They're still not a generative enterprise. Like they're still not thinking end to end, right? So that's an issue they have to tackle. As a provider, I'll go back to this concept of skill and scale. So, will all these jobs move back onshore? My personal belief at this stage is no, because here's what we're going to do. We're going to create a tech and ops platform. And if you look at the best place for that to be created, start to think of markets like India, where we have so much of the technology development and resources and skills existing. And what we're going to think about is how do we run really digital operating centers, right? So we will be training people who'll be able to prompt and run this technology with very little human overlay in the centers of scale. And to me, this opens up actually, as an organization that has a big footprint in India, a tremendous opportunity because work that historically would have gone to the Philippines or to other locations may actually end up in a lower cost location like India, but at a higher performance level because of translation, neutralization, agentics. Centers of skill, then, depending on the product and the service, will end up nearer shore, in smaller footprints, addressing whether it's service to sales, addressing core metrics, superior metrics that can be driven. And that, for us as partners and providers, if all we do is walk into tenders and give rate cards, we've missed the boat with the client in terms of educating them as to how to think about their operating model. It goes all the way back to think of all the target operating model work that was done years ago. I don't even hear that in discussions anymore. What I hear about is technology. This is all about how we separate work and skills effectively and efficiently to drive better performance.
Right, right, right. So what are we going to be talking about, do you think, in 3 years' time? 3 years is enough time that we can kind of see what's happening before it becomes science fiction, Katie. What's the conversation going to be based on then?
I mean, I know you have a son. I have two kids. I really, and when I was listening to your conversation with Jason, uh, to me, I could say quantum computing, I could say blockchain, crypto, all these things. Those are just technologies. To me, I'm coming back to the labor force, right? And really thinking about how are we going to change education? How are we going to change what job requirements are? And I think for any of us, especially in this BPO industry, if we don't get a handle on that and start to think about it, right now, what I hear a lot of candidly, Phil, is let's train the workforce on digital. Okay, great. But does that have a forward lean in terms of what are the skills that we're training them to have? I mean, just learning digital isn't a skill set. We have to go back to now understanding the taxonomy of what are skills, what is career progression, how do we create a career for people? And I don't hear enough conversation around that today. So I'm assuming that that's the laggard that comes into context as we see another form of the Great Resignation or, you know, you know, people being disillusioned with their workforce. And I think we're not through that wave yet. We saw it settle down for a year or so. We saw high attrition. It's come down across the industry. It's going to happen again. And I think that it'll be disillusionment with understanding, what is good performance? How do people get paid? And especially as we look at what does this look like? What is the future of work for all of these workers coming along? What is it? Because if it feels like it's just replacement, we've really missed the fact that yes, it will be fewer workers in any work queue, fewer colleagues in any work queue. But what is the high order work that they're doing, and how do we get them there? I mean, to me, there's a big gap between what they're doing today and what we
Yeah.
think we'll be doing in 2 years.
Yep, I'm with you. I mean, one of the things I took away from my recent India trip is there's so much more engagement across the ecosystem. Like you've got local government. I was talking to students, academics, enterprise customers, vendors, all sorts of people, diplomats from the foreign services helping to drive business, that sort of thing. There's a real ecosystem there. They're working together to figure out how do we all grow, and that is completely missing outside of in Western countries. I'll say the UK, I'll say the US in particular. There's just an increasing disconnect between kids coming out of college and corporate mindsets and what they want to do. And you just saw, I think it's been the worst unemployment amongst Harvard MBAs in the
Yep.
last year. Like they're not walking into jobs like they used to.
Well,
Maybe there's
it's
jobs
also
that they just
interesting.
don't want to do. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of these programs like Harvard, Queens College, all of these are now actually setting up programs in locations like India, right? Because the value proposition, I think, is being questioned and challenged here. And still in emerging markets or in markets like India, students are understanding that there's a value to learn how to learn, but they're being supported by the ecosystem. And look, markets with hundreds of millions of, people that are focused on how do they capture scale and bring that scale together for future prosperity, I think have a leg up on markets that are focused on protectionism and unionism.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. It's also the mindset of when we were starting out, you had a mortgage, you bought your first property, you were on a ladder to somewhere, and you grew with your companies. Now,
Yeah.
I interview kids who want 150 grand starting salary, and I'm like, I can't do that. I run a business.
Yeah.
It's just not feasible. I can hire really good kids in India for 50 grand, right? Who and that's a super salary out there. So there's a real disparation coming between cost of living, salaries, what businesses want, this disconnect between education and society. And on
I
top of that, we have a lot of chaos out there. So
Yeah, I also think it comes back to this, like, fuzzy middle, right? Like, culture, it goes back to that old, what was it, culture eats strategy for breakfast concept from, back in the day. Um, at the top, you can talk about, and I saw that you were talking about like fear of becoming obsolete. Like you can talk about the purpose, you can talk about the vision, but it's really the middle layer, right? Who drive the day to day actions that show someone, okay, if you're ambitious, if you're a learning person, if you keep raising your hand, you can go further. And so I think we have to step back and ask ourselves, like, which ecosystems are promoting and driving that middle layer to behave as sort of the lighthouse for the pyramid coming along, and which ones have maybe waned and lost that edge. And I think that's something as leaders of companies we have to be vigilant about.
right.
And you have to replace talent and send a very strong message around that. Otherwise, that's how these behemoths, and we've seen them with brands I won't name, but in the ITO BPO space, who've lost their edge for periods of time, it's because I think they've lost that connectivity between where the organization is going directionally and how it's driven at the micro decisions of that middle layer every day.
I completely agree with you. And yeah, if you listen to that last podcast, I think Jason mentioned something around we're in a humanist recession,
I love that.
is
Yeah.
yeah, which he talked about. it's not just the economy, it's fear of AI and it's fear of the political landscape. It's scary. It's like, what is going on in the world right now where we have government employees getting fired left, right, and center, and grandstanding, and the media is just going haywire and a lot of stuff. So hopefully this all settles down a bit, but I do hope we're not in this humanist recession.
Well, I think it's also interesting, especially being in the space of customer experiences. How do you think about, for all of these brands, serving the end consumer when the end consumer also has all of these social influences going on around them, right? If you think about what Jason kind of was alluding to, which is some of the rage, the dissatisfaction, ultimately, that is all feeding into a day-to-day, how they're interacting with brands, what they're hearing. Just think about the recent issues with some of the travel brands that have happened that are disastrous and terrible. And all of a sudden, I know I found myself being chased around on the internet with prolific amounts of stories of accidents that have happened. I mean, that's you have to stop and remind yourself that actually we're safer traveling in an airplane than we oftentimes are traveling on the road. But
Yeah.
the internet and digital has changed what we perceive as reality. And this to me is something that's, terrifying in terms of how we think about the relationship between brands and their end consumer, and what's the disintermediation between that's happening in these echo chambers.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Well, centers of skill comes away from this conversation, but changing of mindsets definitely is something that's top
I
of
think
mind walking away from it.
change of mindsets, and I think if I were to leave one thing, Phil, it would be to say, like, so we're not branding ourselves the BPO, but we are coming to market around something called SMART, which is superior metrics, AI-led, agents redefined transformation. And notice transformation is at the end, right? Because the first thing, as I said, is like getting to the real metrics at the level we're talking to. Is it CSAT and first call resolution, or are we actually now talking about customer lifetime value and moving up that chain? If everything we do isn't anchored in the outcome, this whole discussion of how do we transcend and move towards, in the near term, outcome-based commercials, and the long term, then the trust that gets us to, sort of subscription and those sorts of models can't happen. And then AI-led, everything we're doing around redefining agentic workflows, which automate, basically, they simplify, they take friction out, and agents being reimagined. You can't do one without the other. You have to do both. And so I think I listen very carefully to a lot of firms talking about the former, not the latter. And they both have to happen in tandem, right? Because it is the skilling. Agents reimagined how we do that at the speed and scale we have to. And only then you get to transformation. Unfortunately, the big consulting brands have put transformation first. And I think that's a misnomer, right? Because transformation has no destination.
Completely with you. It's wonderful. Well, Katie, it's always great catching up with you. And
We'll see you in New York
I'm
too.
looking forward to we'll see you in New York, and look forward to sharing this pod
Cool.
with the world pretty soon, because this has been a mind-expanding conversation. I've enjoyed it very, very much.
Thanks, Phil. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to From the Horse's Mouth, Intrepid Conversations with Phil Fersht. Remember to follow Phil on LinkedIn and subscribe and like on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favourite platform for no-nonsense takes on the intricate dance between technology, business, and ideological systems. Got something to add to the discussion? Let's have it. Drop us a line at fromthehorsesmouth@hfsresearch.com or connect with Phil on LinkedIn.